The morning sun cast long shadows across the busy streets of downtown as Richard walked into his office at Tech Solutions, a mid-sized tech company where he'd worked for the past 15 years. He settled into his worn leather chair, the same one he'd had since becoming a middle manager, and stared at the photo on his desk. It showed two young boys grinning at the camera, arms around each other's shoulders, him and his older brother Alex. Life had taken them down very different paths since that photo was taken. While Richard had chosen a steady, unremarkable career, Alex had transformed their father's struggling computer repair shop into Crawford Technologies, now worth billions. The tiny shop that once fixed broken laptops had become a global leader in artificial intelligence and cloud computing. Richard sipped his coffee, scrolling through the morning news when a message popped up on his screen. His heart stopped. Crawford Technologies CEO Alex Crawford in critical condition after massive heart attack. The coffee cup slipped from his hand, spilling across his desk. Within hours, Richard found himself rushing through the pristine halls of City General Hospital. The waiting room was filled with board members and company executives, all wearing expressions of barely concealed panic. Their faces turned to him as he entered, some hopeful, others calculating. Mr. Crawford, the chief board member, approached him. "We need to discuss the company's immediate future." Richard wanted to focus on his brother's health, but he understood the weight of the situation. Crawford Technologies employed thousands of people. Its stock price was already dropping as news of Alex's condition spread. That evening, as Richard sat by his brother's hospital bed, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, his phone buzzed constantly with messages from the board. Alex had always been the golden child, the brilliant one who could see opportunities others missed. Richard had been content to live in his shadow, taking pride in his brother's success from a distance. But now, as he looked at the medical equipment keeping his brother alive, Richard felt the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders. The board wanted him to step in as interim CEO. He was the only family member with real business experience. Alex's own son, Peter, was next in line, but had never shown any real interest in the company beyond the wealth it provided. Richard thought back to their childhood, to the countless hours Alex spent taking apart computers in their father's shop, learning how they worked, while Richard preferred playing outside with friends. He remembered Alex's excitement when he made his first sale, and later when he secured their first major contract. Despite their different paths, they had always supported each other. A nurse entered the room to check Alex's vitals, breaking Richard's train of thought. "Your brother is stable," she said kindly, "but recovery from something like this takes time." Richard nodded, his mind already racing with what needed to be done. The next morning, Richard stood before Crawford Technologies' board of directors. His navy suit felt stiff and foreign compared to his usual business casual attire. The boardroom, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, reminded him of how far the company had come from its humble beginnings. "I accept the position of interim CEO," Richard announced, his voice steadier than he felt. "But I want to be clear, my first priority is my brother's recovery. I'll do everything in my power to keep this company strong until he returns." The board members nodded in agreement, but Richard caught glimpses of doubt in their eyes. They wondered if the other Crawford brother could really handle this responsibility. As Richard left the boardroom, his phone buzzed with a text from his nephew Peter, asking about his trust fund payment. Richard felt a twinge of concern. While he'd been distant from the company's operations, he'd heard rumors about Peter's extravagant spending and failed pet projects. Something told him that managing his nephew might prove to be an even bigger challenge than running the company. Looking out over the city from his brother's, now his office, Richard realized this was more than just stepping in temporarily. It was about protecting his brother's legacy, the company their father had started, and the thousands of employees who depended on it. For the first time in his life, Richard Crawford stepped out of his brother's shadow and into the light of his own purpose. Richard sat in his temporary office at Crawford Technologies, reviewing the company's financial reports when a commotion outside caught his attention. His nephew Peter burst through the door, designer sunglasses perched on his head and a cold smoothie in hand, trailing his personal assistant, who looked completely frazzled. "Uncle Rich!" Peter exclaimed, dropping into a leather chair without waiting for an invitation. "Why are my project funds on hold? I was about to close a huge deal." He took a loud sip of his smoothie, seemingly oblivious to the stack of urgent documents on Richard's desk. Richard removed his reading glasses and rubbed his temples. In the 2 weeks since he'd taken over as interim CEO, he'd discovered several concerning patterns in the company's recent investments. Most of them led back to Peter's pet projects, each one more questionable than the last. "Peter," Richard began carefully, "I've been reviewing the virtual reality gaming division you started last quarter. We've invested $30 million, but I can't find any concrete development plans or progress reports." He pulled out a folder filled with transaction records. "Can you explain these expenses?" Peter waved his hand dismissively. "It's all part of the research phase, Uncle Rich. You can't rush innovation. Dad always understood that." He leaned forward, his smoothie forgotten. "Actually, I've got this amazing idea for blockchain-powered virtual pets. It's guaranteed to be the next big thing." Richard thought about his brother lying in the hospital, about how hard Alex had worked to build this company from nothing. The board meeting earlier that morning had been tense, filled with concerned whispers about the company's declining stock price and Peter's role in recent failures. Later that afternoon, Richard called in Linda Chen, the head of accounting, who'd worked for Crawford Technologies for over 20 years. "Tell me honestly," he said, "how bad is it?" Linda pulled out a thick file. In the past year alone, Peter has initiated 6 major projects, each with budgets exceeding $10 million. All of them were abandoned halfway through. She hesitated before continuing. "There's more. We've found some irregular payments to companies we can't trace." Richard spent the next few hours digging deeper into the company records. He discovered lavish business dinners at exclusive clubs, first-class flights to investor meetings that never seemed to produce any investors, and consulting fees paid to companies that appeared to exist only on paper. The next day, Peter didn't show up to an important board meeting about the company's new cloud computing initiative. Instead, Richard's assistant handed him a magazine. Peter was on the cover, partying on a yacht with social media influencers, the headline reading "Tech Hair's $1 Million Birthday Bash." Richard's phone buzzed with a message from the hospital. His brother Alex had shown slight improvements, moving his fingers for the first time since the heart attack. The news should have brought pure joy, but instead, Richard felt a growing sense of dread. He had to make some difficult decisions before his brother woke up. That evening, Richard visited his brother in the hospital. "You always protected him, Alex," he said quietly to his unconscious brother. "You wanted to give him everything we never had growing up." But maybe, he paused, watching the steady rise and fall of Alex's chest, maybe that wasn't what he needed. Back at the office, Richard called an emergency meeting with the company's legal team. The evidence was mounting. Peter's projects weren't just failures. Some of them appeared to be elaborate schemes to funnel company money into his personal accounts. As Richard drove home that night, he passed the old building where their father's computer repair shop had once stood. He remembered how Alex would work late into the night, learning everything he could about technology and business. Peter had inherited his father's intelligence, but none of his work ethic or integrity. The next morning, Richard arrived early to find Peter waiting in his office, looking unusually serious. "I heard you've been asking questions," Peter said, his usual carefree demeanor replaced with something harder. "Just remember, Uncle Rich, this company belongs to my father. When he wakes up—" "When your father wakes up," Richard interrupted quietly, "he'll want to know his company is in safe hands." He met Peter's gaze steadily. "And right now, I'm not sure it is." Peter stood up, his face flushed with anger. "You can't touch me. I'm a Crawford. This company is my birthright." He stormed out, leaving Richard with an even stronger conviction about what needed to be done. Richard looked at the family photo on his desk, him and Alex as children, working in their father's shop, both smiling with hope for the future. Sometimes, he realized, protecting a legacy meant making choices that would hurt the people you love. He picked up his phone and dialed the number for the board chairman. It was time to take action. The early morning silence of Crawford Technologies was broken only by the soft hum of Richard's computer. He'd been coming in at 5 a.m. every day, using these quiet hours to dig deeper into the company's records without drawing attention. A coffee cup sat cold and forgotten beside him as he clicked through files, each new discovery making his stomach sink further. "Sir," His assistant Tom knocked gently on the doorframe. "Mrs. Chen from accounting is here with those files you requested." Linda Chen walked in, carrying a thick folder and looking as tired as Richard felt. She'd been working late nights too, helping him unravel the web of financial transactions that Peter had woven throughout the company. "Look at this," Linda said, spreading documents across Richard's desk. "We found 3 more shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. All of them received consulting fees from Crawford Technologies in the past year." She pointed to a series of transactions. "The money goes in, gets bounced through several accounts, and ends up here, in Peter's private account." Richard leaned back in his chair, run his hands through his graying hair. The evidence was worse than he'd imagined. Beyond the failed projects and wasteful spending, there was a clear pattern of deliberate fraud. His nephew hadn't just been careless with company money, he'd been stealing it systematically. Later that day, Richard visited a small tech startup office across town. The young CEO looked nervous as she shared her story. "Peter approached us about a partnership last year. We were thrilled. I mean, it's Crawford Technologies." She pulled out some contracts. "But after we signed and paid the partnership fee, we never heard from him again. The fee went to this consulting company, not directly to Crawford." Back at the hospital during his daily visit to Alex, Richard watched his brother's peaceful face and felt the weight of responsibility growing heavier. "I wish you could tell me what to do," he whispered. A nurse checking Alex's vitals gave him a sympathetic smile. That evening, Richard met with David Parker, the company's longtime legal counsel, in a quiet restaurant away from the office. "The evidence is solid," David said, reviewing the documents Richard had gathered. "But moving against the CEO's son, it's going to get messy. Are you sure you want to do this?" Richard thought about the thousands of employees whose jobs depended on the company's success, about the small businesses like that startup that had been scammed, about his brother who had spent his life building something meaningful. "I don't want to do this," he replied quietly. "But I have to." The next few weeks became a careful dance. Richard maintained a supportive uncle facade while working with a small, trusted team to document everything. They tracked money trails, interviewed employees who'd witnessed suspicious behavior, and built an anti-case. Peter, seemingly oblivious to the investigation, continued his usual routine of late arrivals and early departures. One afternoon, Peter burst into Richard's office, excited about his latest idea. "Uncle Rich, we need to invest in this new cryptocurrency project. My friends say it's going to be huge." Richard nodded and smiled, all while noting how Peter's friends were connected to another shell company they discovered. During a board meeting, Richard watched Peter give a presentation about his latest venture, noting how skillfully his nephew could talk without saying anything of substance. The board members nodded politely, but Richard caught their concerned glances. They knew something wasn't right, but nobody wanted to be the first to speak up against the CEO's son. At home each night, Richard barely slept. He would sit in his study, looking at old family photos, wondering if he was betraying his brother by going after Peter. But then he would remember the evidence in his safe, the falsified reports, the stolen money, the betrayed trust of employees and partners. One morning, Richard arrived at the office to find an urgent message from the hospital. Alex had shown signs of emerging from his coma. His fingers had moved, and his brain activity had increased. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. Time was running out. Richard called his trusted team together, Linda from accounting, David from legal, and a few key board members who had already been briefed. "It's time," he said, laying out the final pieces of evidence they'd gathered. "We move forward tomorrow." That night, as Richard prepared the presentation that would change everything, he found himself thinking about the day his father had opened that little computer repair shop. He'd been so proud, teaching his sons about honest work and treating customers right. Alex had built on those values to create something extraordinary. Now it was Richard's turn to protect that legacy, even if it meant tearing his family apart. The morning of the emergency board meeting dawned cold and gray. Richard stood at his office window, watching early workers hurry into the Crawford Technologies building, unaware that today would change everything. His phone buzzed, a message from the hospital. Alex had squeezed a nurse's hand. He was waking up. Richard straightened his tie, checked that the USB drive containing all the evidence was secure in his pocket, and headed to the boardroom. He'd arranged for building security to be present, just in case. Peter always arrived late to meetings, so Richard had scheduled this one for 7:30 a.m., ensuring he'd have time to present the evidence before his nephew appeared. The board members filed in quietly, their faces serious. They'd been briefed that this meeting would address serious concerns about company finances, but only a few knew the full extent of what Richard had discovered. Linda Chen from accounting sat ready with stacks of documentation, while David Parker, the legal counsel, arranged his notes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "what I'm about to show you will be difficult to accept. But as leaders of this company, you need to see the truth." He connected his laptop to the projector and began displaying the evidence: bank statements, falsified reports, shell company registrations. The room grew tenser with each revelation. Board members leaned forward, looking at their copies of the documents with growing alarm. Richard had just finished explaining a particularly complex scheme involving fake consulting contracts when the boardroom door burst open. Peter stood there, his face flushed. For once, he'd arrived early. "What's going on here?" he demanded, looking around at the grim faces. His eyes fell on the projection screen showing transaction records from his hidden accounts. The color drained from his face. "Sit down, Peter," Richard said quietly. "The board needs to hear everything." Peter remained standing, his hands clenching into fists. "You can't do this. You're just the stand-in. When my father wakes up—" "Your father is waking up," Richard interrupted. "That's exactly why this needs to happen now." He turned to the board. "We have confirmation of funds being embezzled through shell companies, fake contracts, non-existent consultants, money laundering through supposed tech investments." The next hour was intense. Peter tried to explain away each accusation, but the evidence was overwhelming. Richard had documented everything meticulously. The board members asked sharp questions, their initial shock turning to anger as they realized how they'd been deceived. "This company was built on trust," Richard said, his voice filling the silent room. "Trust from our employees, our partners, our customers. That trust has been betrayed." He looked directly at Peter. "By someone who should have protected it most of all." One of the senior board members, a woman who'd worked with Alex for 20 years, stood up. "I move for an immediate vote on removing Peter Crawford from all positions within the company and freezing his access to company resources." Others quickly seconded the motion. Peter's face contorted with rage. "You can't do this. This is my company, my father." "Your father built this company from nothing," Richard cut in. "He worked endless hours, missed holidays, sacrificed everything to make it succeed. And you treated it like your personal bank account." The vote was unanimous. Security officers stepped forward as Peter was stripped of his company credentials. He knocked over his chair as he stood, pointing at Richard. "You planned this. You're stealing my inheritance. When my father hears about this—" "When your father hears about this," Richard said firmly, "he'll know I did what was necessary to save his life's work." He nodded to security. "Please escort Mr. Crawford out of the building." As Peter was led away, still shouting threats, Richard felt no satisfaction. This was a family tragedy playing out in front of Crawford Technologies' leadership. But looking at the determined faces of the board members, he knew it had been necessary. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings, legal documents, and calls with major shareholders. By evening, when Richard finally had a moment alone in his office, he felt exhausted but relieved. His phone rang. It was the hospital. Alex had opened his eyes. Richard gathered his things quickly, ready to rush to his brother's side. But as he reached the elevator, he paused. Through the window, he could see the city lights coming on, twinkling like stars. Somewhere out there, his nephew was probably already plotting his revenge. The hardest part wasn't over, it was just beginning. In his car, driving to the hospital, Richard thought about family, about duty, about right and wrong. He'd chosen to protect the company over protecting his nephew's reputation. As he parked at the hospital, he hoped his brother would understand that sometimes tough love was the only way to save someone from themselves. Richard hurried down the hospital corridor, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. His heart pounded as he approached his brother's room. The doctor had called. Alex was not only awake but alert enough to talk. As he reached for the door handle, a familiar angry voice from inside made him freeze. "He betrayed us, Dad. While you were lying here sick, Uncle Richard stole everything from me." Peter's voice cracked with emotion. Richard took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Alex lay propped up in bed, looking pale and thin but aware. Peter stood by the bedside, his designer clothes wrinkled, dark circles under his eyes. The room fell silent. Alex's tired eyes moved between his son and his brother, trying to understand the tension. "Richard," he said, his voice weak but clear, "what's happening at my company?" Before Richard could answer, Peter jumped in. He called a secret board meeting. He showed them fake documents, made up lies about me. "They voted me out, Dad. Your own brother stabbed us in the back." Richard pulled a chair close to his brother's bed, ignoring Peter's glare. "Alex, I need you to listen carefully." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thin folder, a summary of everything they'd discovered. "I wish I didn't have to show you this, but you need to know the truth." Over the next half hour, Richard quietly explained what he'd found. The shell companies, the stolen funds, the fake contracts. With each revelation, Alex's face grew more drawn, more pained. Peter kept trying to interrupt, but Alex raised a shaking hand to silence him. "The money from the Children's Hospital Project," Alex asked weakly, referring to a charity initiative he'd started years ago. Richard nodded sadly. "Diverted through a fake consulting firm. We traced it to an offshore account." Alex closed his eyes, a tear rolling down his cheek. "Peter, tell me this isn't true." The silence that followed was deafening. Peter's angry facade cracked, showing fear for the first time. "Dad, I was going to pay it all back. I just needed to make some big deals work. Uncle Richard doesn't understand business like we do. He's jealous. He always has been. Remember how he chose the safe path while you built something great?" "I chose the honest path," Richard said quietly. "Like Dad taught us in the repair shop. Remember what he always said, Alex? Fix it right or don't fix it at all." Alex opened his eyes, looking at his son with a mixture of sadness and disappointment that made Peter step back. "The repair shop," Alex whispered. "I started working there when I was 12. Learned everything from Dad. Handed tools to him after school while other kids played. Built something from nothing." He turned to Peter. "What did you ever build, son? What did you ever repair?" "I gave you everything. Maybe that was my biggest mistake." Peter's face crumpled. "Dad, please. I'm your son. He's just your brother. He can't take my place." "This isn't about taking your place," Richard said, standing up. "This is about protecting what your father built. Protecting the jobs of thousands of people who depend on Crawford Technologies. Protecting your father's legacy." Alex reached for the folder with trembling hands, reading through the evidence slowly. The room was silent except for the beeping of hospital monitors. Finally, he looked up at his son. "You didn't just steal money, Peter. You stole trust. You stole opportunities from people who needed them. You stole from sick children." "I can fix it," Peter pleaded. "Give me another chance." "No," Alex said firmly, his voice stronger now. "Richard did the right thing. The hard thing." He looked at his brother with newfound respect. "You protected the company when I couldn't. When I was blind to what was happening." Peter's face hardened. "Fine. Take his side. But I'll fight this. I've already talked to lawyers. I'll tell everyone how you two planned this together, waited until Dad was sick to steal my inheritance." Richard watched as Alex pressed the nurse call button. "Son," Alex said sadly, "the only thing being stolen here was by you. Please leave. I can't look at you right now." As nurses entered the room, responding to the call, Peter stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Richard sat back down beside his brother, who suddenly looked every bit his age. "I failed him," Alex whispered. "Gave him everything except what he really needed." Richard took his brother's hand. "We can't change the past, but we can protect the future." Outside the window, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Two brothers sat together in silence, both knowing that while this chapter was ending, a new one was just beginning. The downtown courthouse buzzed with activity as Richard walked through the security checkpoint. It had been 3 months since the confrontation at the hospital, and today was the first hearing in Peter's lawsuit against Crawford Technologies. His nephew had hired one of the city's most aggressive law firms, determined to fight his way back into the company. Richard adjusted his tie as he waited for the elevator, remembering the newspaper headline that morning. Tech Hair Shoes Family Company claims uncle's hostile takeover during father's illness. The media had latched onto the story, painting it as a real-life drama of family betrayal and corporate intrigue. Inside the courtroom, Richard sat with David Parker, their company lawyer, and watched as Peter strutted in with his legal team. His nephew wore an expensive suit and a practiced expression of victimhood. The gallery was packed with reporters and curious onlookers, all eager to witness the family drama unfold. "All rise," called the bailiff as Judge Wilson entered the courtroom. The judge, a stern-looking woman with gray hair, surveyed the room with experienced eyes. "Let's be clear," she began. "This court isn't interested in family squabbles. We're here to examine evidence and determine if any laws were broken." Peter's lawyer stood first, painting a picture of a jealous uncle taking advantage of his brother's illness to seize control of the company. "Your Honor, my client was the rightful heir to Crawford Technologies. While his father lay in a hospital bed, his uncle orchestrated a coup using fabricated evidence to turn the board against him." Richard listened calmly, but his hands clenched under the table as the lawyer twisted the truth. When it was their turn, David Parker approached the podium with a cart full of evidence boxes. "Your Honor, we have documented proof of systematic fraud spanning 3 years." Over the next several hours, David methodically presented their evidence. Bank statements showing millions diverted through shell companies. Emails proving Peter had known exactly what he was doing. Testimony from employees who'd been pressured to falsify reports. During a break, Richard stood in the courthouse hallway, sipping water from a paper cup. He watched Peter holding an impromptu press conference, playing to the cameras. "This is a sad day when family turns against family," Peter was saying, his voice thick with fake emotion. "My father built this company for me, his only son." The afternoon session brought surprise testimony from Linda Chen, the head of accounting. She described discovering the first irregularities in Peter's expenses, her voice steady as she detailed how the fraud had grown more sophisticated over time. "He threatened to fire me when I questioned certain transactions," she revealed, causing murmurs in the courtroom. But the biggest shock came when Alex himself was wheeled into the courtroom. Still weak from his heart attack but determined to speak, he had insisted on testifying. Peter's face went pale at the sight of his father. "I built Crawford Technologies from nothing," Alex began, his voice quiet but firm. "Started in a tiny repair shop, worked 18-hour days, missed my son's birthdays because I was building something meaningful." He paused, looking directly at Peter. "I thought I was building it for him. Instead, he tried to tear it down." As Alex described his heartbreak at discovering his son's actions, several jury members wiped away tears. Peter stared at the table, unable to meet his father's eyes. Richard noticed his nephew's confident facade cracking for the first time since the trial began. The day ended with Judge Wilson reviewing the mountain of evidence. "We'll reconvene tomorrow," she announced. "But I must say, Mr. Crawford," she looked at Peter, "the evidence against you is substantial." Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around both parties. Richard declined to comment, but he heard Peter shouting behind him, "This isn't over. That company belongs to me." That evening, Richard visited Alex at home, where he was recovering. They sat in the garden, watching the sunset. "He was offered a plea deal today," Richard said quietly. "If he admits to the fraud and agrees to stay away from the company, they won't push for jail time." Alex nodded slowly, looking older than his years. "My son might be a thief, but I don't want him in prison. I just want him to understand what he did wrong." He turned to Richard. "Thank you, little brother, for being stronger than I was, for seeing what I couldn't see." As Richard drove home that night, he thought about the family photos still sitting on his desk at work. They told the story of their father's little repair shop growing into something amazing, of two brothers taking different paths, but supporting each other, of a son who had everything but valued nothing. 1 year had passed since the courtroom drama that had torn the Crawford family apart. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Crawford Technologies' main conference room as Richard prepared for the annual shareholders' meeting. The company had not just survived the scandal, it had thrived. Richard straightened the papers on the podium, glancing at the framed photo he brought from his old office. It showed their father's computer repair shop, with young Alex and Richard standing proudly in front. He placed it there as a reminder of where they'd started and how far they'd come. The room filled quickly with shareholders, board members, and key employees. Their faces showed none of the worry that had been so evident a year ago. The company's stock price had doubled in the past 12 months, thanks to several successful new projects and restored trust from investors. Alex sat in the front row, looking healthier than he had in years. After recovering from his heart attack, he'd chosen to step back from day-to-day operations, becoming chairman of the board, while Richard continued as CEO. The brothers had found a perfect balance. Alex's vision combined with Richard's steady management style. "Good morning," Richard began, his voice confident but humble. "A year ago, we faced the biggest crisis in our company's history. Today, I'm proud to report that Crawford Technologies is stronger than ever." He clicked to the first slide, showing record-breaking quarterly results. As Richard presented the company's achievements, he remembered the difficult months that had followed Peter's trial. His nephew had eventually accepted the plea deal, avoiding jail time but being permanently barred from any involvement with the company. The last Richard had heard, Peter was living in a small apartment, working an entry-level job at a tech startup across the country. The presentation moved to their new initiatives. The Children's Hospital project, which Peter had once stolen from, was now fully funded and expanding. They'd launched a scholarship program for young tech entrepreneurs, teaching them not just about innovation, but about business ethics and responsibility. "Our father taught us that success isn't just about making money," Richard said, glancing at Alex. "It's about building something that makes a difference. About fixing things properly, whether it's a broken computer or a broken trust." After the meeting, Richard found himself in his office with Alex, sharing a quiet moment. "Remember when we thought the scandal would destroy us?" Alex asked, looking out at the city skyline. "Instead, it made us stronger." Richard nodded. "We went back to basics, like when Dad would make us double-check every repair before returning a computer to a customer." He paused. "Have you heard from Peter lately?" Alex's face showed a flicker of pain. "He sent me a letter last month. For the first time, he actually apologized. Said he's learning what it means to earn something instead of just taking it." He smiled sadly. Maybe losing everything was the wake-up call he needed. Later that afternoon, Richard visited their old neighborhood. The building that had housed their father's repair shop was now a coffee shop, but a small plaque on the wall recognized it as the birthplace of Crawford Technologies. As he stood there, a young woman approached him, holding a laptop. "Excuse me," she said. "Aren't you Richard Crawford?" "I'm in the scholarship program." Her eyes shone with enthusiasm. "I've been developing software to help small repair shops manage their business better. Would you mind taking a look?" Richard smiled, remembering how his father had always made time to help others learn. "Let's go inside," he said, gesturing to the coffee shop. "I'd love to hear about it." That evening, driving home, Richard thought about how life had come full circle. The company had grown beyond anything their father could have imagined, but its heart remained the same: helping people, doing things right, building something meaningful. His phone buzzed with a text from Alex. "Dad would be proud of us." Richard smiled, knowing it was true. They had protected more than just a company. They had preserved a legacy of integrity, hard work, and family values. At home, Richard sat in his study, looking at another old photo. This one showing him and Alex as kids, playing with a broken radio they were trying to fix. The caption their father had written still made him smile. "My boys, learning that anything broken can be fixed with patience, knowledge, and honest work." Some things had been broken over the past year: trust, relationships, family bonds. But like their father taught them, broken things could be fixed if you were willing to do the work. The company was stronger, the brothers were closer, and somewhere out there, even Peter was learning to build something real. As night fell over the city, Richard thought about tomorrow's challenges, new innovations to develop, more young entrepreneurs to mentor. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning a new chapter, built on a foundation stronger than ever before.